Good evening, everyone. Come on in and find a seat. It's a real pleasure to see everyone here tonight. We want to welcome you to Narrative Medicine Rounds. It's our first rounds of the fall season. My name is Deepu Gowda. I'm an internist here at Columbia. I see patients in a community-based clinic here, and I've been involved with the program in narrative medicine for many years, since I was an intern. And I also run a course in the medical school called Foundations of Clinical Medicine Tutorials. And that's the course in the medical school where we work with first and second year students and teach them how to take an interview at the bedside. And we teach them about the physical exam. A very formative period in their training. And the work of narrative medicine has deeply influenced the way we educate students at Columbia. And not only at the medical school, it's also influenced the way we educate students together in an interprofessional sense. Nurses, doctors, dentists, public health experts to be. So it's only fitting that we are in this building in the School of Public Health to convene today, because the work of healthcare is really drawing on the strengths of many different professions, and we found doing the work of narrative medicine to be transformative. And I also wanted to let you know that Narrative Medicine Rounds always takes place on the first Wednesday of every month. So I ask you to mark your calendars. On October 1st, we'll have writer and biographer D.T. Max with us. November 5th, filmmaker Kathy Leichter will join us. And December 3rd, writer Will Boast and author of The Empathy Exams, Leslie Jameson, will join us. And at this point, I invite Professor Maura Spiegel to come up to introduce our guest today. Maura Spiegel is a professor in the English department. She teaches writing and film to master's students, undergraduates, and to our medical students. She teaches a film class to our medical students that I've had the pleasure of sitting in on. Maura Spiegel.
Hi, it really is with a very special and very personal pleasure that I introduce Amy Arbus to you. Before I recount just a portion of her remarkable achievements, I have to share, although it might sound like boasting, that Amy and I have been friends since we were little girls. We ambled and prowled and shared many adventures and some misadventures in Greenwich Village, where she lived, and on the Lower East Side, where I grew up. And one memorable February night in 1969, we saw Janis Joplin perform at the Fillmore East together. I hope that Amy will give us a glimpse into some of the pages of her astonishing 5 books. Each project is so distinctive and so fully realized that you can't imagine what's coming next. Her images have appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, Vanity Fair, Rolling Stone, and so many other places, and they belong to collections around the world, including the New York Public Library and the Museum of Modern Art. She's had more than 25 solo shows around the globe. She teaches at the International Center for Photography and at many other places. A documentary film called On the Street chronicles her years shooting on the street, the fashion page that she created for the Village Voice in the 1980s. She began that work when she was only in her early 20s. From such a young age, her friends, some of whom are here today, marveled at how she understood how to be a consummate professional, making her way in the world, carrying with grace the blessing and challenge of her name, never claiming the privileges of the great artist that she is. Like great photographers before her, she re-spins the world for us, finds what is hidden in plain sight. Excitedly, I welcome Amy Arbus.
Well, I begin this evening in tears because I'm so touched, but you'll forgive me if I wipe them away. My dear friend Maura Spiegel invited me to speak to you today because I teach the narrative portrait at the International Center of Photography. We thought you'd be interested in exploring the differences between the written and the visual essay. One of the biggest discrepancies is the way they handle time. The written text can go back and forth, while the visual suspends the passage of time. The written word can be quite literal, while the visual tends to be more symbolic. For example, an image of a person walking into an ocean, fully clothed, might suggest something ominous, while a stairway to nowhere could reference the uncertainty of life. And a light at the end of the tunnel might signify hope. A single image can communicate many things at once, evoking a mood and raising more questions than it answers. The guy, actually, just to digress for a moment, the guy who took the picture of his parents fully clothed walking into a body of water was my youngest student ever, a high school student. In 1992, I became intrigued with the journalistic approach to portraiture because it has the potential to present a more complete portrayal of a person in context over time. This prompted me to ask my students to tell a story in 3 or more photographs, to introduce the characters, to show the conflict and its resolution. The single narrative implies that something has just taken place or is about to take place, while the collective narrative is a series that describes a person or people over time, like W. Eugene Smith's Life magazine series, Country Doctor, which I will show you. Next summer, I'm scheduled to teach the personal narrative with a master storyteller, writer, and great listener, James Lacine, who would be great to be a guest here, by the way. James works like a sleuth in collaboration with his students, trying to uncover their essential truths. He might ask what happened to cause a series of events to determine the inciting incident, the climax, and its resolution. Then he'll ask them to define the opposite traits or proclivities that have created the dynamic between the characters. For example, shame and pride, risk and safety, acceptance and rejection, future and past, hidden and revealed, crazy and sane. And these are relevant as I proceed. Then he'll work backwards to find the where and the when, to figure out what the exposition might be. I sought his help in telling my story, for which I think this is the perfect forum, because it is medical, for one reason, and sharing it with you might actually help somebody. I was always a terrifically cheerful kid. Everyone noticed and commented on it, and it became an identity of sorts. When my mother took her own life in 1971, I had a terrible phobia about depression because I knew it could be inherited. I spent my life trying to prove that I wasn't afflicted, which of course often caused people to suspect I was. Some colleagues actually perceived of depression as craziness and feared that if they were in the presence of someone suffering it, they were likely to catch it. Even I, who should know better, have been guilty of disappearing from friends suffering from depression as though it were a communicable disease. At the age of 53, I had to have a preventative oophorectomy. I had been warned that being put into surgical menopause could cause depression. And as you know, I have a family history. Despite this recipe for disaster, when I was overcome with depression, none of the medical professionals I sought knew how to treat me. I was misdiagnosed, mistreated, literally, and left untreated. I had heard horror stories about people being put into psych wards and not being able to get out. When my surgeon said she would be my advocate I didn't understand the term in a medical logistic sense, so I didn't accept her offer. At first, like most people, I was given the wrong meds that made me worse. Then I was told that I seemed okay. My response was, I don't think waking up crying for 3 hours every day is okay. I was still very upbeat much of the time, like you see me now, quick to smile with a boisterous laugh. I didn't know how to describe my symptoms, and unbeknownst to me, I became an expert at hiding them. I suffered from depression for almost a year until I begged my dad and his wife to take me to the Cedars-Sinai emergency room. It wasn't until I was in the ER, lying on a gurney, talking to the head of the psych department, that I could articulate my symptoms. I spoke of an overwhelming sense of dread that would descend on me the moment I woke up. I actually saw in his eyes that he recognized the feeling, which was a great comfort to me, by the way. I was treated the following week, and within 3 days, the worst of my symptoms subsided. I recently read an article in the New York Times about a medical practitioner who witnessed a home care professional talking to a patient. She understood both what the doctor said and what the patient heard, and they were wildly different scenarios. Whether it be auditory, visual, or written, patients and doctors don't speak the same language because a patient has more at stake. When I am a patient, I'm terrified of my possible diagnosis and therefore unable to hear what I'm being told. If a diagnosis were always accompanied by a plan of action, it wouldn't feel quite so overwhelming and foreboding. I've devoted my life to capturing people's feelings on film, yet ironically, I'm afraid to expose my own. We have so much to learn by reading people's expressions and body language, but if we aren't paying attention, it's what we don't see in others or even ourselves that might kill us. First, I'll show you excerpted photographs from Country Doctor, and then I'll show you some highlights from my love affair with photography and read from related texts. In 1948, W. Eugene Smith spent 23 days in Kremlin, Colorado, chronicling the challenges faced by the general practitioner, Dr. Ernest Seriani. Seriani was the sole physician for an area of about 400 square miles, inhabited by some 2,000 people. Smith's style was to, in his own words, fade into the wallpaper. You know, we don't have the luxury these days of spending 23 days following a subject, but he was considered the greatest photo essay artist ever, and he sort of started it. So here is my early work, and I'm going to read an excerpt from A.M. Holmes's introduction to my book. Arbus's photographs, like her personality, have an inherent dichotomy. They are both gentle and rough-edged. She is shy, well, maybe I was then, but impulsive. And her work is both very direct and deceptively organized. Although her pictures are posed, they seem oddly spontaneous. They are not staged, not produced. They are as impromptu as it gets. They seem to be both out of time and place. In 1991, I spent 3 months photographing prostitutes near the Lincoln Tunnel in New York City. For the first time, I had to work surreptitiously because the girls wouldn't agree to be photographed. I say that in parentheses. I wrote a short piece called The Waiting Game, which was to run with the photos in the Village Voice. Here's an excerpt. The girls have names like Blue, Ruby, and Pearl, and the pimps have names like Chicago and Mississippi. Being known as a color or jewel seems to give the girls a false sense of anonymity. Many of them are blonde and quite sensational looking, but there's not a chance that one could be confused with the next. There doesn't seem to be much work. The girls do a lot of waiting around. Whoops. They get condoms from their pimps or from the guys slinking around in the shadows, clutching their rolled up brown paper bags. They also take turns going to the deli a lot. Getting condoms seems to be the main activity of the evening. To me, these pictures are very romantic, despite the fact that what I saw was heartbreaking, which refers back to what we were just talking about. I found the girls to be very brave and strong, almost heroic. I envied their profound, if tragic, understanding of human nature. They had a skill which I never learned. They knew how to manipulate men. Despite their stoicism, they suffered terribly. After a few weeks, they would disappear. When I asked after them, the story was always the same. She got sick, she moved away, or she died. Later that year, I was commissioned to do a photo essay on a nudist camp for Self magazine. Initially, it was terrifying to be expected to disrobe in public. But once the writer and I forced ourselves, it all seemed surprisingly normal. Yolanda Cuomo, the art director itself at the time, Self magazine, was enormously helpful to me. She said, when people read this story, they should feel as though it were their own experience, so the pictures should look like family snapshots taken on a summer vacation. This was tremendously liberating to me. It was a license to make deceptively simple, sophisticated snapshots. The only thing I changed in this photograph was I asked the guy in the t-shirt if he would mind sitting on the end of the bench, because I thought it would look cool. This guy is with his nanny and his wife. And this is the writer and I, both named Amy, posing for our little, writer's credit in the front of the magazine. And I left a lot of space on the top of the image so that it would look like a snapshot. And they, of course, cropped it in, so it looked like a bad photograph. I did not excerpt the story behind these photographs, which is that all my friends were pregnant at the same time. And I was going through the, I don't know if I need to have a baby or not time in my life. So, plus there were 9 people having babies. And I kind of panicked. I was broke at the time, and I thought, how am I gonna come up with 9 baby gifts? So instead I thought, what's the perfect gift? I can give them a picture of their newborn. So for the foreword of this book, I wrote, newborn babies are so individual, their feelings are so clear, and their responses so unmistakably their own. For what I've seen in the past year and a half, after being around 227 babies between the ages of 11 days and 6 months, I gather that being an infant is pretty overwhelming. Tiredness is exhaustion. Digestive problems are all-consuming. And hunger is an emergency. You would think if they didn't eat, they'd starve to death immediately. But each crisis is fleeting. Psychologists claim that an infant's expression changes every 7 seconds. about twice as rapidly as an adult's, which actually completely changed my way of photographing them because I had to be really fast. He reminds me of comedy and tragedy. And these were my favorite babies that I invited to a Halloween party. And I forgot that some of them had learned to crawl already, so we had a special person cleaning up the pee on the backdrop. It was intense. This is Mercer, having just been born, and this is her just a year or so back. They're all, I think they're 1992. They're 22, 21. Rites and Rituals is a series that I've spent a really long time doing, and it has no text yet because it hasn't found its form. This was done in Sicily during Easter week, and my students and I chased the story of the crucifixion and the resurrection from town to town. And it was not an event for tourists, so we were told not to even bother bringing our flash, which was a great lesson for us all in terms of not interrupting what was going on, and exposing film and getting shadow detail. This is from a group that I took to Cuba, and we just wandered into a dance class. Can't do that here. But dance in Cuba is, the only ticket out of poverty and out of the island itself. So a lot of pressure is put on the little girls, even the ones like this who clearly are not going to succeed. And this is Irish dance taken in Staten Island. And this is the Puerto Rican Day Parade many years back. But one of the reasons I'm in New York is because it looks like it's one world. And this is the Civil War reenactment that I go to every year in Pennsylvania. And I've also watched the girl on our left grow up because I've seen her over the years. This is another event I go to every year. This is the West Indies Labor Day Parade, but it's for the kids, so it happens a couple days before. And it was just the other day. And these are some commissions that have some really amazing stories. This is Julie Crone, who was a jockey that was injured twice really badly. And she was making a comeback, and I was assigned by Newsweek magazine to photograph her. And we were at Belmont, and we were setting up right next to where they were warming up the horses. And I had a very inexperienced assistant who kept, flinching and moving really quickly, and the horses were shying. It was a total disaster. So the PR person said to me, he saw a Polaroid, which in those days we had to take to check the lighting and the framing and so on. And he said, "Why are you so far back?" And I said, "Well, I'm leaving room for the horse." And he said, "No, there's no horse. You're not photographing a horse. It's just Julie." And I said, "Oh, no, I really need a horse because, it's going to be a woman with a helmet and we won't know, her triumph over disaster and all this stuff." And it sounds very melodramatic, but I actually thought, oh no, this is horrible. My life as a photographer is over. One disaster and I'll never come back. And instead of calling my editor at the crack of dawn, which I probably should have done, I just took the pictures without the horse, and it looked terrible. And I was defeated. And as I walked, we got along really well. She actually was a collector of my mom's work. And so she knew a lot about photography, and we had a lot to talk about. And as I was leaving, she chased me and said, "Amy, hurry, you've got to come back." So there was a horse lying on the floor in a stall. She put a cube of sugar in her mouth, and they started kissing. And because I had what was considered the wrong film, color temperature-wise, I've got this amazing, blue horse in a yellow room. So I felt like that was a real gift from the photo gods. And Julie. This is the original Hedwig and the Angry Inch. And working with John Cameron Mitchell and his partner Stephen Trask was a delight because they're very bright, like frighteningly so, and knew how to be photographed and knew what would look good, and so it was a real collaboration and really exciting. I'm completely obsessed with the new version that's on Broadway now. These are the three sons of the Reverend Jim Jones. They survived the mass murder in Guyana because they were playing a basketball tournament. And their dad called them and said, "You don't know the story, it's amazing." He said, "You have to get back here right now." And one of the guys said to his dad, "No, you don't understand, we're going to win." And it was a standoff, and they arrived home the next day and everybody was gone, including their dad. So this was, the New Yorker getting everybody, all the brothers together, and there were all sorts of other weird things, like 2 of the brothers were named Jim because one was, biological and another was adopted. A very complicated whole thing. I used to be the photographer they would send if it was a difficult story. So this woman had a difficult story. Joyce Silverman was being stalked by Judge Watler. And the reason she wanted to be in New York Magazine was because he was getting out of his halfway house, and she thought, I need to protect my 13-year-old daughter from, he was sending her condoms and just being really vulgar and scary. So in order to show her situation, I went through this elaborate lighting thing to have my assistant stand in the hallway and shine a light at the mirror so that he would throw a shadow behind her. And the directive from the magazine was, we can't have her smiling. So again, she's got her fabulous little suit on, Chanel suit, and I'm thinking she's standing there like smiling, this fake smile, and what am I going to do? So again, to check the lighting, I took a Polaroid, and she wasn't ready, and she said at the time, "You got me." And then I had this dilemma: do I make my client happy or do I make her happy? Because clearly she's going to be... I knew it was the right thing for the article, but I knew she wouldn't be happy because she didn't look good. This was a great job. It was for World Gym, and I think the slogan was something like "Look better naked" or something like that. So I've had to photograph naked people all over the streets of New York. I want to read you, this was, everything about this book is it was a book on actors out of the context of their plays. And I want to read you from John Patrick Shanley's intro to my book. Here's what I see in these photographs. The practitioners of ritual have been removed from their temple. Separated from their invented context, we can more clearly see the fiction they defend. Theater is a ritual of belief, not belief itself. Amy Arbus has captured the holiness of fakery. The unspoken hope in each of the pictures is that the partition separating the two worlds will, for a brief pause, collapse, that reality and imagination will unite. The result would be a gasp of freedom. Look at each page and you'll see the same thing, liars telling the truth. It's unsettling. It's arcane and ancient. It's theater. After the book was published, I couldn't stop doing it. So I continued with the Addams Family and Lurch, who could make his head disappear. This is Shakespeare in the Park, which I'm a big fan of. And Matthew Bourne's Swan Lake. Brian Wallace, the chief curator at ICP, said about this series, Amy Arbus is fearless. I wish. But he did mean it in this specific case. She leaps right into the age-old tussle between painting and photography by audaciously restaging for her camera some of modernism's most iconic avant-garde portraits. Her astonishing and pitch-perfect pictures say as much about the sweetly treasured past of painting as they do about the unpredictably hybrid future of photography. So these pictures were actually made on commission. So people signed up to have their portraits made in this fashion. And I'd never worked in 8x10, so I had a team supporting me, coating the plates, and I've learned how to do it since, but it's so toxic and so expensive and so specific that one needs a real topic to match it to. There's something magical about them that can't be created any other way. And the people would arrive having planned their whole look, which I thought was wonderful. It was like they brought a change of clothes. That's the same girl. And a change of attitude. And, you know, so many of my projects have taken years to come to fruition. And I only had an hour with these Polish scouts in New Jersey during a birthday party for the guy who invented the scouts. The entire day was a ceremony in Polish. I ironically am Polish, but I can't speak a word. So I didn't know much of what was going on, and I was told not to bring my portrait camera because I would only be able to do journalistic photographs. But during lunch hour, I just pulled people aside. I was all set up, and I pulled people aside, and I made these 8 pictures that are now on exhibit in Provincetown, Massachusetts. It's kind of thrilling to do something in an hour. And just so you know, there was, some production values. Like I brought a background which stayed in the car because we liked the curtain so much more. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Happy to take questions.
I'm curious if how your personal narrative affects your picture making. Are the pictures about you, or are they about the subjects, or is it a blend?
Did you all get that? Okay. How does my personal narrative affect my portraits? I have this debate with my students. Is the portrait about the subject? Is it about the photographer, or is it about the audience? And I'm not sure. I think different photographers are different. It's like some of us are mirrors and some of us are windows. Do you know what I mean?
And where do you see yourself in that?
I would like to believe that I'm investigating what they're like. But I can't, even a journalist has their own feelings. And being sensitive to that just automatically makes you impose things on it. I also felt like when I worked for magazines that I was often given a story and asked to illustrate the story, which I thought was really wrong-headed, because I thought that my responsibility was to reveal something hidden that was not in the story. And also, by the time I actually photographed the person, the story had been written and the situation had changed. So if the writer had said, very dapper in his blah, 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 I arrive and he's wearing blue jeans. And I'm like, oh, would you mind putting on the suit with the, oh, I don't have that anymore, or it's at the cleaners. You know what I mean? So that was my major concern, I think, was try to discover something that somebody else didn't see. Anybody else?
Can I ask you something about your mom?
Yeah.
What would you say is maybe long-term effects on you? Just in light of the recent thing with Robin Williams.
Oh, long-term effect of suicide?
Pardon me?
Of your parents' suicide? I can't think of anything that I haven't talked about tonight. You try to prove you're not, and then when you get to the place where inevitability happens, it's always a shock. And then you're floundering around waiting to be, I'm sort of relieved that I know what depression is all about. Is that what you're asking?
I'm not sure.
Robin Williams, boy, I had a debate with my psychiatrist about whether he had Parkinson's, because I said I was suspicious about the way that came out a couple days later. And she said, oh no, he really did have Parkinson's. And there's photographs where you can tell, and there's medications that cause depression to worsen. And the theory is that he was on some. So that was sort of nice, to be comforted by somebody who knew more than I did about that. And I thought it just made it more palatable for the rest of us. To think that he took his own life because of alcoholism or his constant battle with depression, that sort of leaves us lost. But if it was, oh my God, he's got a debilitating illness that he will never recover from, then it's like, oh, well, that makes sense, And
Look
what I was told at least, was that the meds that they gave him to slow the onset of the symptoms caused him to become so depressed that he actually took his own life, not the fact that he had just been in recovery. So there was all that stuff. I thought the mother was protecting the children. And I was relieved to hear that he really had Parkinson's, because it made it easier for me to accept his loss. So, yeah, it doesn't get better. In the back?
About the book on the babies, I didn't really understand the title of the book, because the photos are so, I don't know, happy in a sort of way, and the title is The Inconvenience of Being Born. So I really...
That's so nice. Did you all hear that? Okay, so the pictures seem happy, and it's called The Inconvenience of Being Born. It's not an original title. It's an homage to somebody, and it was given to me by someone else. But it's what I talked about in the essay, the fact that it's so difficult to be an infant, and it's so difficult to be a person, frankly. But I'm really touched that you notice that the pictures are happy, because when people compare my work to my mother's and they're really looking, they see a real different affect in them. I know a lot of people, students and colleagues, that photograph a lot more like my mother than I do. So it's nice that you recognized something positive.
I noticed such a range of different approaches that you used in the portraiture, and I just wondered, is there anything in particular that you feel most connected to, or that you liked best of types of things that you explored?
The books are up here, by the way, for you to look at. We don't have any for sale here, but you're welcome to take a look. It's hard to say, it's like, well, which is your favorite child? On the street, both On the Street and The Fourth Wall were my own invention. Well, actually, the others were too. But it's really hard to say which is my favorite. I think working on the street, I was really comfortable, and it taught me a lot about engaging with people, and the camera was a real excuse, because I was a very shy child. And I would just stare at people, not knowing it was rude, and all of a sudden I had this excuse to stare at people, which was... And also, it was in the 80s, it was a compliment. Can I take your picture? It wasn't an imposition, and it wasn't scary. It was an honor. So that was really fun to do. It was challenging, because my editors wanted me to keep getting stranger and weirder outfits and so on. The babies, I learned a lot about human nature. That was quite fascinating. Like, I did some research, and I could have never learned what I learned through the camera, and that was pretty exciting. The Fourth Wall was something I didn't know what I was doing for a long time. I was kind of dancing around this topic for a long time. And then when I got access, I was like, oh my God, this is it. And that was thrilling. And then working logistically, it was really challenging. Even though New York Magazine was commissioning me after the first year or two, I think, when I was doing it on my own, somehow getting through the red tape on Broadway is just not fun. And less and less fun, rather than more and more fun, as one would think. After Images took an entire crew, and that was very challenging, because everybody had different ideas. But the great part about it was that everybody was performing at their highest level. Like the makeup artist had never done anything but make people look beautiful. He'd never painted a body. He'd never painted to look like a painting. The second assistant is a painter, and he had never painted clothes. The stylist, was coming up with ideas that I could have never conceived of. And so watching a team, we worked every week for 9 months, and we did pictures over and over again, to the chagrin of my entire crew. They were like, just fix it in post, which is one of my least favorite phrases in the world, because that can't be done. I mean, you can't change a photograph in post-production, not make it good when it didn't start out being good. You can make it better. So I love them all.
It's great to hear about the process, so thank you.
Hi.
I saw, of course, the picture of Madonna, and I'm wondering what it was like being an artist in that era, if that was formative for you, and also curious about that New York and what it's like being an artist in New York today.
Heartbreaking, in a word. Yeah, the movie On the Street is very sad because it talks about how none of us can afford to live here anymore. I mean, if I were the age I was then, it would be completely hopeless. So it's a totally different New York than it was, but I'm still here because of what it has to offer. So it's a constant battle of being sad that New York doesn't exist anymore, and being happy that I still have access to it. I'm one of the lucky ones that got to stay. Being an artist at that time, the camera gave me access to the cool people. I wasn't cool until I associated with them. And I knew that they were super cool, and I knew that they would go on to succeed, because there wasn't a question. In the early 80s, before AIDS descended upon us, everybody was empowered. Like, I want to be, a rock star, and look what happened. I mean, you could see it in the photograph. She knew she was going to succeed. And so that was thrilling. That was thrilling. And there was a brief couple of years when I thought, I can't make a living as a photographer. This is hopeless. And I went back to school to be a therapist of sorts. And I just realized this is all I've got. This is what I'm good at. So I feel lucky to have been able to do it then. Somebody way in the back?
Thank you for sharing your beautiful photos with us. In your photo essay of the folks at the Lincoln Tunnel and in your commissioned work of Joy Silverman, you discussed a tension between the subject's desire to be represented or how they wanted to be represented and your personal preference in how they should be captured or what should be revealed. So I was wondering how you navigated those tensions.
Okay, did y'all get that? Well, the prostitutes never got published in the Village Voice because they said although they loved the pictures, they were furious at how expensive it had been, even though I cleared it first. But they were also said that they felt that the photographs were sexist against women. And I couldn't quite understand what they were talking about. But I think what they were getting at was that I was romanticizing them. And in some way, journalistically, that's not okay. But I think what's interesting is the way they made me feel. Because, I mean, one doesn't expect to envy somebody in a desperate situation. Did I feel like I was telling their story? Not really. They couldn't be photographed, so it wasn't a matter of how did they want to show themselves. It was a legal issue. You know, they were doing something illegal, and, you know, I would have had to have gotten permission and had them sign off on it, and it was a whole, you know, it would have been a totally different thing. I think it's some of my, well, it's certainly my most romantic work, and it's some of my strongest work, and I broke all the rules that I learned in school about, you know, in photography, about how to expose film and process and what was possible to do. And so I guess that's important to me, you know, that kind of seeing something differently than other people would see it. Does that answer? Not really. Well, in order to protect their identity, we shaded out their faces, we changed license plates, so, I mean, I don't know if we were protecting them or me. I would have been the one who would be sued. But the weird thing about a lawsuit when somebody says, that's me, is that nobody would ever know unless they said, that's me. So they're kind of contributing to the problem if they were to be upset. I didn't have moral issues about doing it, and they didn't publish them initially, so it wasn't even an issue for many years. They were published in Europe before the Village Voice called me 10 years later and asked to publish them. And I got to read the story, and it didn't make any implications about the particular people that I photographed. So, I mean, just for an example, I was offered to, how are we doing on time? I was offered to, Wally Lamb was writing a book about schizophrenia, and they wanted to use one of the infant pictures on the cover. And for me, this would have been huge. Not huge money, but huge fame. To be on the cover of his book, and it was also Oprah's book club book, and it was a big deal. But I wrote a letter to the parents, and I said, how would you feel about this? And before I got an answer, I got the text, read the first 3 chapters, and said no. And because it was very specific about schizophrenia, and I didn't want these kids to live with that issue. So, so they hired a photographer to copy my picture, and they used it on the cover of the book. So, you know, I protected Matthew and Marika, but ultimately, I kind of got screwed, you know?
We have time for one more question.
Thanks so much. Really enjoyed your talk. I have a question about what you think that photography, and specifically your work, can teach us in the medical profession that want to use narrative medicine to be better for our patients. So what can your work, because I love the baby stuff too, that's wonderful. What can your work tell us as practitioners?
Actually, yeah, the babies are going to be shown at NYU Medical Langone Center. So yeah, I think a lot, actually. You know, empathy is something that isn't always innate. So I don't know. I think that the more you reach, I mean, that story I tell about hearing what you want to hear, seeing what you want to see, it's all so mysterious. And if you're not working with all your faculties, so much can be missed. And I have a friend going through it right now. They've diagnosed her and they cannot treat her. And I'm watching her decompose. I mean, it's just terrifying. So I don't know specifically about which picture can do what for you, but I'm hoping that it really does. It's very close to my heart. Thank you.
I want to thank you for that last question, because I think that really gets to the heart of what your photos ask us to do, is step out of ourselves and enter into the experience of another person, which is really at the core of what we're doing with our medical practice. So thank you for that. I want to thank you for your generosity with which you shared your own personal story in your essay, and also generosity of sharing these beautiful pictures with us. With that, thank you and have a great night, and we'll see you next month.